I'm Lisa Fletcher, and you're in the stream. Today, should a person have the right to have someone help them die when they want to end their life? We examine the ethical and legal perspectives on assisted suicide and euthanasia. Filling in as digital producer is Anousheh Hossain. You can always follow her on Twitter at Anousheh's Point, or her personal blog is anoushehspoint.com. She's looking out for your live feedback. Anousheh, people tend to have a really strong opinion on this. Some feel it's a right of choice, others strongly disagree. What's our community saying?
Our online community is extremely divided on this issue, Lisa, and people feel really strongly about their beliefs and their stance. So I'm going to be pulling up your tweets throughout the show. If you at home want to join us, our online community, please tweet me using the hashtag AJStream.
To Anousheh's right is Professor Abdulaziz Sachedina. He works in the Religious Studies Department at the University of Virginia. He's also the author of many books. One is titled Islamic Biomedical Ethics. Abdulaziz, thanks for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
I also want to welcome our Google Plus Hangout. Hey guys, we're going to be getting to your comments and questions in just a bit. But if you want to join our next Google Plus Hangout, you need to add us to your circles. Simply go to plus.google.com and search for the stream. Here are some of the hashtags we're following today. Should people be able to choose to die by the hand of another? Tony Nicklinson wanted that choice, but his request was denied by the British High Court. He had what's called locked-in syndrome. It's a condition in which a patient cannot move or verbally communicate due to complete paralysis of all of your voluntary muscles. Tony lived with this condition for 7 years after suffering a stroke. Take a listen to why he was seeking legal approval for assisted suicide.
First, it is important for me because it determines what sort of death awaits me. If I win, it means that I have a pain-free death. If I lose, I am faced with the choice of living until I die of natural causes or starving myself to death. Either option is not particularly inviting. So for me, it is literally the difference between an unhappy life or a good death. Second, I am doing this so that no one has to suffer the indignities I have had to suffer if they decide this sort of life is not for them. I would want the law to recognize that there are some circumstances where deciding to commit suicide is a legitimate choice for a person to make.
Now, after losing the legal bid to end his life by assisted suicide, Tony did what he promised. He starved himself and he died in 6 days. His case sparked public debate on euthanasia and assisted suicide. Is choosing death part of human freedom and a right of choice? And are there circumstances where deciding to commit suicide is a legitimate choice for a person to make? To help us answer some of these questions, we are joined via Skype from London by Penny Lewis. She's a professor of law at King's College London. She also writes for the Center of Medical Law and Ethics blog. Penny, welcome to the stream.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I want to start with you. Do you think people should have the right to choose to die with the help of or at the hand of another person?
Well, my work really looks at the way in which jurisdictions make decisions about these sorts of issues. So I look at jurisdictions where these kinds of acts are permitted and jurisdictions where they're not, and try and sort of look at how well safeguards are met, how well they ensure that only people who want to have assisted dying actually receive it, and also look at how legal change comes about in places where it's currently not permitted.
Okay. Professor Sachedina, you've studied in India, Iran, Iraq, Canada. You work here in the U.S. teaching students. Do people have a tendency to grapple with this issue the same way globally, or are there some pretty distinct differences when you start getting into the discussions?
There are certainly very distinct ways in which people in their own cultural setting make those decisions. And I think what happens here is that we have never allowed the quality of life question to be put in the religious communities, because there is a positive take on the human suffering. So if I suffer, maybe it is for my own good that I suffer, maybe I'll be purified. So many times there is, submission to the suffering. And religiously also, it's a very important value that it is treated as almost a purgatory, that all right, I'm going to be purified, therefore let me suffer. And the longer I suffer, the better. So, but now for the first time, the ethical communities, religious communities are asking questions about the quality of life, and that's the main major ethical issue. Who defines the quality of life? Do the religious communities define it? Do the medical team define that quality? What exactly do we mean by that? For example, the video we saw of the London men, of England, it clearly showed that there was no quality of life there. The person really was struggling, even to make right decisions up to the end of life. And therefore, I think the whole question of the quality of life has assumed a great importance. Now, in the Muslim cultures, for the first time, they're also asking the question about, the quality of life. Is it a good life if somebody else is, giving you these medications, you don't consciously make any kinds of decisions? I think that's what even the professional community is faced with. What are we supposed to do when the quality of life is not good? Should we help the person to die?
Our online community is picking up on those themes you just mentioned. I have a tweet here from Opinionated Hijabi. Disagree. We got people in nursing homes on feeding tubes without family visiting. That's rejection of life's value, not assisted suicide. I want to go over to Google Hangout for a second. We have Neha Shastri joining us from Washington, D.C. Neha?
Hi. So I was just wondering, in relation to Tony Nicklinson, wouldn't establishing a legal criteria for euthanasia perhaps stop such incidences from happening? So, despite, the fact that the court did deny to change the law for him to have an assisted suicide, he did then stop eating or taking his medication, which then resulted in his death.
Okay, Penny, before you answer that, because it is a legal question, I do want us to listen to a part of an interview that we did earlier with Jane Nicklinson, and it was her husband, Tony Nicklinson, that had this legal bid to end his life. She explained to us the legal arguments that they used to try to convince the courts to grant her husband the right to assisted suicide. Let's take a listen.
There was two bits to it. First of all, we argued that it was against his human rights, the fact that, you or I can go out and commit suicide, but because Tony was disabled, he couldn't. And there was also this law of necessity that exists here, which is very rarely being used. And we argued that the only way to relieve Tony's suffering was to end his life. There was nothing else that could be done for him. But the judges saw fit to basically ignore what we said and just say that what the opposition wanted was that it was for Parliament to decide, not for the judges.
So, Penny, your take on the Nicklinson's argument, and then also I'd like you to comment on Neha's question regarding a framework for euthanasia.
Absolutely. So if we look at Mr. Nicklinson's argument, I think one of the important aspects of it is that he actually wasn't asking for an assisted suicide. Because he was so disabled, his argument was, I can't commit suicide even with assistance. What I want is euthanasia, so termination of his life at his request, which is lawful in the Netherlands and Belgium and Luxembourg, but nowhere else. And he was arguing, as his wife said, on two bases. One was this defense of necessity, which is actually the way in which euthanasia became lawful in the Netherlands, although the law is slightly different there, which we need to keep in mind. But it was that kind of necessity argument, the I'm suffering terribly, and there's an overwhelming necessity to help me with that suffering, and the only way to do that is to terminate my life. He also made a human rights argument that his rights to control the time and manner of his death was being infringed by effectively the law of murder, which is what prevents active euthanasia. And you're right that the High Court rejected both of those arguments. Now, he would have gone on to appeal had he lived. So there was still two other levels of appeal that he could have brought. But clearly, because of his death, there's no prospect of those appeals being brought now.
Some would argue, Penny, that he had to endure more suffering because he wasn't granted his wish by the court, so he starved himself for 6 days.
I mean, I think we don't really know a huge amount about what happened in the last few days of Mr. Nicklinson's life. We know that he was diagnosed with pneumonia because that was information that was released by his solicitor, and that he had an advanced decision to refuse treatment, which he had made some years earlier, and it appears then that he refused treatment for the pneumonia. So I'm not sure that we know the role of his decision not to eat in his death, but certainly he refused treatment. And I think that kind of brings us back to Neha's question, because it makes us realize that we do permit a certain amount of end-of-life decision-making already.
Yeah.
End-of-life decision-making that's based on quality of life, often either by the person themselves saying, you know, my quality of life is such that I don't want to have any more treatment, which is what Mr. Nicklinson did, or if the person's not able to make that decision for themselves, we do make decisions about withdrawing treatment on the grounds that it's futile or that it's no longer benefiting the person. And those decisions do result in death in some cases. And in fact, in every country in the world, even countries where euthanasia and assisted suicide is legal, there's far more decision making that results in death that is a consequence of withdrawal or withholding of life-sustaining treatment. So deciding not to treat someone anymore, that's much more common as an end-of-life decision than euthanasia and assisted suicide.
So, Professor Sachedina, what's the difference between stopping treatment and deliberately assisting in someone's suicide?
I think the differentiation is very much derived from an important bioethical principle in the Islamic tradition we have. For example, no harm, no harassment. I have a right to reject harm to me. When I know my treatment is not working for me, it's not improving my condition, and the medical team is clearly telling me that there's no chance to really cure you, then I have a right to say, I don't want any more treatment. And then they can stop, for example, life-sustaining treatment, and they can stop, for example, the machines that are using on me. This is, by the way, a kind of an endorsement of passive euthanasia. Although it is not active, but I can make a decision to stop the treatment that is not producing the result they expect to produce it. So that, I think, really endorses what we call the idea of quality of life. I can reject something that's not improving the quality of life for me. It's simply keeping me alive without having any chance for me to really get completely cured. That way, I think, passive euthanasia has been endorsed in many parts of the Muslim world that I know.
You just spoke to a whole group of medical professionals a couple of days ago.
Right.
Does the issue of quality of death ever come up as a topic?
Yes, it does. Now we have really sensitized the public that we really need to discuss, are we really helping the patient who's terminally ill? Are we curing this condition? I think we are not. Sometimes medical professions, they don't want to see somebody dying. In the medical culture, it's very hard to accept your patient's death. So they insist that they can try. But I think recognition of one's limit in the medical profession is very important. It really requires the medical profession to say that we have done enough, and now it's time to stop. Now that would lead to passive euthanasia. There's still a problem that active euthanasia would not be justifiable.
I want to pick up on that theme you just brought up about the medical community, but first I want to go to a Facebook comment we have from Michael Sigma. It's important to understand, regardless of what one thinks about assisted suicide, that one is never morally justified to make a blanket decision that everybody has to abide by. This is a very personal matter that everyone has to decide for himself or herself. Even if you are strongly against the practice, you should not take away someone else's right to make that determination. I want to quickly go over to our Google Hangout. We have Shrina Brahmbhatt from Boston. Shrina?
Hi. So as a medical student, we are taught and trained to be healers, acting only to prolong survival. So if you think euthanasia should be justified, then should the medical education and approach also be changed?
I think what we are dealing with is allowing somebody to die rather than taking a decision to end a life. And I think allowing somebody to die is ethically acceptable. because we are somehow letting someone's death take a natural course rather than intervening scientifically and creating a set of treatments that are not producing the result. And I think that's what happens many a times with we had a case in University of Virginia Medical, in the healthcare institution, and I was called upon. An Iraqi gentleman had suffered stroke, and the medical opinion was very clear that there is no chance for him to survive. The question was, should they start him on ventilator or respirator? And this was the question that came to me as a bioethicist, knowing Iraqi culture very well. And I think we were able to decide that if it's not going to improve his condition, then it was perfectly all right not to start the treatment. That would cost the family enormous wealth, which they don't have.
Well, I want to follow up on that with this whole idea of self-determination. People who are in favor of assisted suicide or euthanasia saying, I should be able to determine when and how I want to die. I want to look at a short clip. It's from a documentary called Terry Pratchett, Choosing to Die. The president of Dignitas, which is a Swiss-based nonprofit organization that provides assisted suicide services in accordance with Swiss law, talks about his take on the right to self-determination. Take a listen.
I got acquainted with the European Convention on Human Rights, and this has changed my life. And in Article 8, there is the right to self-determination.
You mean an actual human right to die?
An actual human right to die.
Even when they haven't a terminal or progressive illness, even if it's just a weariness of life.
Yes, the right to self-determination should include also the right to make a decision upon one's own end.
Penny, I'd like to get your thoughts on this idea of self-determination and the human right, as he called it, to die.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting interpretation of Article 8, I think. I mean, Article 8 does give you a certain right to self-determination, and in particular, a right to bodily integrity. So if we go back to what Professor Sachedina was saying about the no harm principle, again, I can say, I don't want antibiotics if I get pneumonia. That certainly is protected by Article 8. And it is true that the European Court of Human Rights, which is the ultimate court which determines these issues in Europe, has said that the right to sort of control the time and manner of one's death is covered by Article 8. But there's a second part of that, as is very common in these kind of human rights documents, like, for example, the U.S. Bill of Rights is the American example. There's a kind of a but that follows on, and that allows those kind of but clauses. They allow for the state to infringe on people's rights if they have certain kinds of justification. So if you imagine a seatbelt law, a law that requires you to wear a seatbelt, well, that infringes on my self-determination, right? I can't decide for myself whether to wear a seatbelt because there are penalties attached to not wearing one. But the state has a good reason for interfering there. And similarly, in the context of assisted dying, the European Court of Human Rights has held that there are good reasons for allowing the state to prohibit assisted dying if that is what the state chooses to do. And so when there was a case involving a British woman a few years ago who wanted an assisted suicide, and she challenged the criminal prohibition on assisted suicide in the UK, and she lost. So yes, she has a right of self-determination, but the state can sort of tread on that in order to protect what the court said was the rights of other people. They were concerned about vulnerable people possibly being pressured into an assisted death.
So the courts are trying to prevent an unrequested assisted death, essentially?
Yes, I think that's what the UK was arguing as the state in that case, that they were concerned about pressure on people. They were concerned about elderly and vulnerable people who might end up with an assisted death that perhaps they didn't really want. So even if they'd made a request, maybe it wasn't a real request.
I'm going to go
now,
over
we can have a debate about whether or not that's a real concern, a concern that is borne out by the evidence. But nonetheless, I think, what is clear is that this right of self-determination is not as unfettered as Mr. Minnelli, the head of Dignitas, suggested in that clip.
Penny, I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to cut you off real quick. We have to go to Google Hangout. Amy Hasbrook is joining us from Canada, Valleyfield. Amy?
Yeah. Hiya.
Hi.
I just wanted to go back to what Ms. Lewis was saying about the state's intervention in individual liberty. And another very good example of that is that when someone says they want to kill themselves, if it's a non-disabled person, that person could be put in a psychiatric hospital against their will. And this is a very important point on this issue because it points out the distinction between how people who are ill or disabled are treated when they say they want to kill themselves versus how non-disabled people are treated. And this is basically what happens is if a person who doesn't have a disability comes into a psychiatrist's office and says, I feel really awful, I want to kill myself, and my life is terrible, I have no quality of life, the psychiatrist will say, well, we'll put you on medications. And if the psychiatrist doesn't feel that person can go home safely by himself, he may commit that person involuntarily to a psychiatric hospital. If a person with a disability or who has an illness comes in and says exactly the same thing, that person may be allowed to avail themselves of assisted suicide. The only difference is because the person has a disability and society is making a judgment on the value of their life. The question is, why don't people with disabilities have equal access to suicide prevention programs? And I'm not just talking about getting in the door. I'm talking about the attitudes of mental health personnel.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop you there. We understand the question, Professor. I want you to answer that quickly because then Anusha's got some more tweets.
You see, the whole idea about the principle of autonomy, that I have autonomous right to make decision, anything that's pertaining me, I think is weak because in the religious communities generally, in the communitarian ethics, people are related to one another. When I make a decision about myself, I'm not alone. I'm really making a decision through my horizontal connections with all my family members, all my friends, everybody else. So it's not only me who is, when we talk about self-determination, that's very individualistic. And I think there is a danger here to somehow dilute human relationships. I think part of the culture in which we are living, and this problem becomes even more accentuated, I think the reason is that we really don't care anymore for each other the way we used to care in the traditional societies. I think modernity has impinged upon our relationships, and it doesn't allow us to really be caring for others, and therefore these questions become quite important questions.
I want to go to our online community here for a second. I have a tweet from Alexandros. He says, religion shouldn't have anything to do with this. It should be a personal choice, and once again, religion gets involved. I also have a tweet here from Joe Common. AJ Stream, and by the way, keeping someone alive against their will to have them suffer is also torture. Ever think of that? I have a video question that I actually want to pose to you, Mr. Sachedina. Let's pull it up.
People don't casually or thoughtlessly attempt suicide. The suffering that leads to the desire to die is immense, and forcing the sufferer to prolong their life is cruel. I think we must allow self-determination in life or death, and in fact, the right to control one's own death is the strongest affirmation of individual autonomy in the face of incurable illness and disability. What is the benefit to the individual or to society of forcing someone to prolong their life against their will?
Exactly. All right, Professor Sachedina, I'm going to have you hold that thought. We are going to get his answer in our online post show, and we're also going to talk about some of the risks of legalizing euthanasia. So everybody sit tight. Go to stream.aljazeera.com where we will continue this discussion. Now on Wednesday, in U.S. politics, expand the Tea Party versus Occupy. But our question tomorrow is, do these movements have more in common than you might think? Tweet us your thoughts. And until then, we'll see you online.
I'm the one who doesn't have
Welcome back to the Streams Online Post Show. We're talking about euthanasia and doctor-assisted suicide and where that fits in to society, and if it does. And we left off in the main show with a question being posed to Professor Sachedina, and we're now going to hear the answer.
Yeah, I think there is one danger, though, in physician-assisted suicide, that sometimes those decisions could be made very hastily by the person who suffers a lot. And I do recognize that it is a very painful situation for the individual who goes through that illness. And I know what happens. I've seen cases with my own eyes. I'm a chaplain in the university hospital. So I go on the bedside of these people who are terminally ill. And what they go through, nobody understands. Sometimes even the medical team doesn't understand. But at the same time, if we were to legalize this, I think the criteria that we need, a number of criteria that we need, would somehow be regulated and unregulated. And I'm afraid that most of the time they would not be regulated, and the decisions would be made simply on the basis of the sympathy or, requirement. Sometimes the family makes the decision. So we have surrogate decision makers. And we don't know whether they will make the decision because they're tired of this individual who, they think should be, rid of, or, are they really in the interest of the person who is ill? So I think what we are faced with is a really troublesome situation, ethically speaking.
Penny, Professor Sachedina makes an interesting point. If euthanasia and doctor-assisted suicide were to be broadly legalized, how do you define the standard in a way that is not so subjective?
Well, I think we can learn from countries that have already tried it, or places that have already tried it, because of course Oregon and Washington State have both have physician-assisted suicide. I think if we look first of all at this question about whether or not we might end up in a situation where we were having surrogate decision makers, none of the places where either euthanasia or assisted suicide is legal now permit surrogate decision makers. There are a few jurisdictions which allow people to make a decision in advance when they're, for instance, likely to become incompetent subsequently. The Netherlands and Belgium both permit that, but actually when you look at the number of cases, it's incredibly rare. I think doctors maybe feel a bit uncomfortable about it, or they simply, or people simply don't do it. People simply don't make advanced decisions for euthanasia, or well, certainly you wouldn't for assisted suicide. But more broadly, if we're thinking about how to design a regime that is robust, I think you have to focus on certain kinds of criteria, and there would be a set of criteria around the individual's request. So we would think about making sure the person was competent to make a decision, that they understood all of the relevant information, including information about the alternatives that might be available to them, particularly in the context of a terminally ill patient, alternatives like palliative and hospice care, and that those were real alternatives that they could indeed make use of if they chose to, that the request is being made voluntarily, so it's their decision, they're not being pressured by somebody else. And then we would want to think about what kind of criteria would we want to impose? So some places have assisted suicide only for people who are terminally ill. Oregon is like that. But other places have a criterion that's based on suffering. So the Netherlands and Belgium, for example, they look at whether or not the person is experiencing unbearable and hopeless suffering. Now, you might be terminally ill and experiencing that suffering, but it's not limited to terminal illness.
Penny, I'm going to
so
bring
I think
in
we would
our
have to choose
Google
what kind
Hangout.
of criteria
I'm so
we
sorry,
wanted.
I have to cut you off. We have to go to our Google Hangout. Amy, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think one of the issues is that assessing the question of voluntariness is essential, because people who live with disabilities, first of all, if they've had services and supports withdrawn that enable them to live effectively in the community, if someone is in a nursing home where their entire lives are regimented by the schedule of the nursing home, that certainly is not a life where they have determination and control over their situation. And so when you pose the issue of voluntariness in that situation, I don't think it's a realistic assessment because the person has no choice in life. How can they make a proper choice in death? And certain, as the legal profession knows, assessing voluntariness in undue influences cases is extremely difficult because you can't separate when it's a close relative, when the person is constantly exposed to the notion that their life, the value of their life is less than those who are younger or those who will continue after. That is going to affect the assessment.
Penny, not Penny, I'm sorry, Professor Sachedina, just got about 30 seconds left. Would love to get your final thoughts.
I think we are dealing at the global level. There are cultures in the world that I know where surrogate decision makers are the one who are controlling the final decisions in terms of the terminally ill patient. And that's where the fear is, that autonomy, or what we call the patient's consent, would not be available at all. And surrogate decision makers like the family members might intervene and interfere with the general welfare of the patient who is terminally ill. So we really need to balance autonomy with the community concerns, with the familial concerns. I think ultimately that decision has to be a collective decision rather than one person making that decision.
Professor Sachedina, Penny Lewis, everyone on our Google Hangout, thanks so much for your contribution today. But before we go, we are going to continue our coverage of the Democratic National Convention in Charlotte, where Malika is already there. For our lead segment today, she caught up with Minnesota Representative Keith Ellison, an avid tweeter with more than 30,000 followers. As the first Muslim elected to U.S. Congress, Ellison faced targeted attacks based on his religious identity. Malika asked him if anything has changed since he took office in 2007.
Well, you know, things, they have changed, but in many ways they've stayed the same. Some ways the battles have gotten tougher, and other ways they've gotten better. And in some cases, the stakes have even gone up because as Muslims, particularly in swing states like Florida, like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Nevada, New Mexico, as Muslims in these communities get more engaged politically, what it means is that they have the power to determine the outcome of an election. And so people who don't want to see that are getting more aggressive. And yet the Muslim community is stepping up to the moment and saying, you know, we don't care if you want us engaged in American life. We're going to be, because it's our right to be as Americans.
So there's a tweet here from Simhar who says, everybody counts, everybody matters. And that's in reference to a tweet from Ramesbo who says, how important is the Somali vote for Keith Ellison in Minnesota?
No one can get elected anymore without the Somali community in Minneapolis. If you're running for mayor or governor, you need to have an in with the Somali community and be able to win their trust. It's a sophisticated community. They know when somebody's just selling them soap. They will ask you, what is your program? What is your vision? What have you done? What will you do? And who knows about it? And so I'm excited to be able to represent America's largest Somali community.
There's another tweet here from Olufin who says, what travel abroad are you undertaking and how is it shaping your worldview on education, healthcare, and employment?
Well, I want to thank Olufin for this question because a lot of times as members of Congress, we get criticism for foreign travel. But I believe that given that the United States is a member of a global world, and we have a foreign policy, and we have different interests to look out for, it's crazy to complain when members of Congress go abroad on behalf of the United States. It's very important in this globalizing world, in this world where we're trading more, where something like H1N1 can get on a plane and be in the United States within a short period of time. We cannot close ourselves off to the world.
All right, on Wednesday, in U.S. politics, it's been the Tea Party versus Occupy Wall Street. But do these movements have more in common than you think? Tweet us your thoughts, and until then, we'll see you online.